Mark was excited when he and his wife, Emma, moved into their new home. It was a charming Victorian house on the outskirts of a quiet town. But something about the property felt off from the start. Mark often heard faint whispers at night. Emma laughed it off, saying old houses make strange noises. But the whispers became more distinct. One night, while unpacking boxes in the attic, Mark felt someone watching him. He turned around, but saw nothing except shadows dancing across the walls. He shrugged it off, blaming exhaustion. Weeks passed, and the strange occurrences only intensified. Lights flickered randomly, doors creaked open by themselves, and objects were often misplaced. One evening, Mark heard laughter coming from the basement. Thinking it was Emma, he called out to her. But when he reached the bottom of the stairs, the laughter abruptly stopped. The basement was completely empty. In desperation, they hired a priest to bless the house. After the blessing, however, the activity became even worse. Mark began seeing shadows darting in the corners of his eyes. One night, he woke up to find a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed. The figure whispered his name in a voice that sounded both familiar and chilling. Emma didn't believe him until she experienced the same phenomenon. They learned from a neighbor that the house had a dark history. The previous owners had vanished mysteriously, leaving behind only whispers of tragedy. Unable to live with the terror any longer, Mark and Emma moved out. But the shadows didn't stay behind. Even in their new home, they could feel the cold presence and hear the familiar whispers. The shadows had followed them. Moral: not all dreams are worth chasing, especially when they come with a dark past. Mark and his friends decided to escape the chaos of city life and spend a weekend in the mountains. They rented a secluded cabin, deep in the woods. The journey there was smooth, and the cabin appeared perfect, at first. The first night, they noticed strange symbols carved into the wooden beams inside. Symbols they didn't recognize. Mark felt uneasy, but his friends laughed it off, calling it rustic decor. As the night wore on, they heard faint knocking on the windows. They assumed it was just animals, and tried to ignore it. But the knocking continued, growing louder and moving from one window to another. When Mark peeked outside, he saw nothing but pitch-black darkness. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The next morning, they discovered strange footprints around the cabin. The prints didn't match any animals they knew. And they were far too large to be human. Determined not to let fear ruin their trip, they decided to stay. That evening, the air turned icy cold, despite the roaring fire in the fireplace. Mark heard faint whispers calling his name from the woods. When he mentioned it, his friends confessed they had heard it too. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut on its own. The lights flickered, and the whispers grew louder. Panicking, they decided to leave, but their car wouldn't start. Trapped, they spent the night huddled together, too terrified to sleep. The next morning, they found their car perfectly fine, as if nothing had happened. They drove back to the city, vowing never to return. Weeks later, Mark found one of the strange symbols carved into his apartment wall. It seemed the cabin's presence had followed him home. Moral: some places are best left unexplored, for not all escapes lead to peace. Mark was an avid collector of antiques, always on the hunt for rare items with a story behind them. One day, he found an ornate mirror at an estate sale. The seller claimed it had been passed down through generations and was over a century old. Mark placed it in his living room, admiring the craftsmanship. But from the very first night, he noticed something strange. Whenever he passed by the mirror, his reflection seemed to linger a moment longer than it should. He dismissed it as his imagination, but the reflections began to act differently. They would move when Mark didn't, or even make strange expressions. One evening, while sitting on the couch, Mark glanced at the mirror. His reflection stood completely still, even though Mark had moved. Feeling a chill run down his spine, Mark turned the mirror to face the wall. But the activity didn't stop. Mark began hearing tapping noises from behind the mirror. And at night, he dreamed of a shadowy figure emerging from it. Desperate for answers, Mark researched the mirror's history. He found out that it once belonged to a family that mysteriously disappeared under strange circumstances. Locals believed the mirror had trapped the spirits of the family. Mark decided to get rid of the mirror, but when he tried to move it, the mirror cracked slightly, releasing a dark mist. The room grew cold, and the tapping turned to loud, desperate banging. Terrified, Mark fled his home. When he returned with help, the mirror was gone, but the unsettling presence remained. Mark knew the mirror had followed him, and it would always be with him. Moral: not all treasures are worth keeping, for some come with a price that can never be paid back. Overall moral: curiosity can lead us into the unknown, but not all paths are meant to be traveled. It's a reminder that some things are better left undiscovered, as they may come with consequences far too dark to understand.